This is our agenda for tonight's session on North Carolina election law basics. We'll cover registering to vote, photo ID requirements for when you cast your vote, how to vote, what happens to our ballots, and then we'll wrap up with some next steps. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and throw it to Kat Lawson.
All right, thank you so much, Christy. And I'm going to pick up where Christy left off and share my screen now. It's so great to see you all tonight. My goal for tonight is to talk about what are the basics of North Carolina election law in the year of our Lord 2025? What stayed the same since 24? What has changed? So we'll go through a fair amount of topics tonight, but really why I like doing this session and why I'm so glad that you all are here for it is because this information really matters. We are seeing a lot of misinformation. We are seeing a lot of changing of the rules coming from the Republicans. And it is more important than ever that we as Democrats have good, truthful, accurate information where we are able to empower people when they are figuring out how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. All of that, hopefully bringing them over to, and that's why you should vote for Democrats. So I am very committed to the Democratic Party being good partners to voters when it comes to people knowing their rights and knowing what they can and can't do, and understanding that at the end of the day, voting is the thing that makes a democracy a democracy. There are a lot of other rights that are essential to a functioning democracy, a healthy democracy, but at the root of all of those rights and all of the responsibilities that come with self-government, the most fundamental one is having the right to vote. So thank you all so much for being here. Like Christy said, pop questions into the chat. We'll keep an eye on that, and I'll make sure to answer all of the questions that I possibly can. But to start off first, we're essentially going to walk through the life cycle of the voting process. So we're going to start off with talking about the process of registering to vote. So the first thing to know is for you all who are here, who I'm sure can answer this question with a yes, but is always to double check, are you registered to vote? Making sure that your registration is up to date. We are seeing some attacks on registration files for voters, which we'll talk about in this little section, but it's always a good idea to periodically check to make sure that no shenanigans have been pulled on your voter registration. So you can do that at iwillvote.com, but you can also just go directly to the state board's website if you want to look up your voter file and to see what your status is. So there are a lot of reasons that people might not be registered, right? Even when they think they are registered. So it might be that for some voters, they submitted a registration application, but the address verification process failed. So every time that you file a application to register to vote, they have to send you postcards. And so if that postcard gets returned to your county board of elections, if it happens twice, then all of a sudden they will say, well, that is an incomplete registration. It didn't successfully finish. So sometimes you have a problem where the USPS mishandled it, or it just hasn't come back yet. Might also be that you submitted a registration application or an updated voter registration form within the last 30 days. And there's just a bit of an administrative lag time between a voter registration application being submitted and it actually getting processed and recorded in the state system. Might also be that you've been moved to an inactive status. So if a voter doesn't vote in 2 presidential election cycles in a row, then they get moved to inactive. All they need to do to become active again is show up to vote, but this could be something that can confuse folks. We've also seen the toggling of the inactive status be a little bit unpredictable in the last few months. So it's something just for voters to know that it can happen. Being inactive is not a reason that you won't be allowed to vote, however. But really, the most common reason that people are not registered to vote is because they haven't actually
I'm
filled out the
sorry?
form. So some places will automatically register people to vote when they go to the DMV to get their driver's license, or sometimes when somebody turns 18. But North Carolina doesn't do that. We have to proactively seek out being registered and submit those files. So the qualifications to register to vote, to be a voter in North Carolina are one, you do have to be a United States citizen. So that can either be a natural born citizen or a naturalized citizen, somebody who has earned citizenship through, right, the application and naturalization process. That person has to also live in the county where they are registering for at least 30 days before election day. So for this fall, that's going to be October 5th. And they have to submit that registration 25 days before election day. This cycle, that's October 10th. with the caveat of this is if you don't use same day registration. So we'll talk about that. But if you're just submitting your form through the DMV or you're submitting the paperwork, those are the deadlines that are going to be relevant. And then you have to be at least 18 years old by November 4th. So somebody who is 17, right, on October 10th, but is going to turn 18 on November 1st, for example, they're allowed to register before they've turned 18, so long as they will be turning 18 when they go in and they show up to vote. The only disqualification there is to vote is that you have been convicted of a felony and are still serving a sentence. So you can be charged with a felony, you can be convicted of a misdemeanor, you can have other problems with your criminal record, and those will still not be barriers to vote. You have to have actually been convicted of a felony, and you have to be still serving an active sentence. So once your sentence is finished, right, and that might include any supervision or probation at the end, once somebody's been released, that person is allowed to come in and register to vote again and to go in and exercise their right to vote in North Carolina. So these are it. This is the only disqualification when it comes to voting. So long as you satisfy those other three criteria, you are allowed to be a voter in North Carolina. Um, and so the process of how somebody goes about registering, right? The way that many people come across this process is through the DMV. So the DMV has an online application form that somebody can go in, submit a registration or update their registration if they've moved or if they've had a name change or anything like that. But that's a really easy way to go in and do it. I will say sometimes it takes a little bit of time for the DMV data to transfer over to the State Board of Elections data. So it's just something where it's a good thing to do if you have time to burn, essentially, but it's a very convenient method for a lot of folks. The other way, and some of you who maybe have done registration drives, for example, have probably seen this before. The other way to register to vote, right, is to submit the actual physical paper. And so there is an online form that voters can download that they can submit to their county board of elections, and they have to fill out all these different forms, all the different boxes on the form. One part of this form that I am going to call out because it's been the source of a lot of drama lately. In 2023, this form was updated to require either the last four digits of a social security number or somebody's driver's license. And if they don't have one of those two numbers, they have to say that they don't have one of those two numbers in order to go through an alternative identification process. Before 2023, this form didn't say that you had to use one of those two numbers in your form, which is what has resulted in a lot of voter files in our state being challenged today. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth, but pointing it out, if you've done voter registration forms in the past, if you've done registration drives in the past, and you weren't paying attention to this particular part of the form, it is something to pay close attention to. Starting essentially now, voters who do not include one of those two numbers when they submit this form are at risk of having their voter registration application being rejected. So make sure that if you're helping somebody to fill out their voter registration form, if you know somebody is, just make sure that they fill out all of those required parts. And then the last option for submitting a voter registration application is going to be at early voting. So North Carolina has same day registration. We've had this for a very long time now. And that just means that you can be an unregistered voter, or you can have a voter who needs to update their file. And you can do that during early voting. So for this fall, that's going to be October 16th through November 1st. With the caveat, check your local county. During municipal elections, which is what we have this fall, not every single county is going to have early voting. So you might know that during even numbered years for our big state and our federal elections, counties are required to offer a minimum number of hours and locations for early voting. That's not true during the municipal elections, mostly because municipalities have to foot the bill for their elections. And so they're given this little out of if you just don't have the funds to pay for early voting sites, you don't need to do it. So make sure that if you are counting on, or somebody you know is counting on early voting to update their voter registration or to register for the first time, make sure to check that your county actually has that as an option. For people who are going to come and use same day registration in order to register to vote for the first time, they're going to need to bring two different things. They're going to need to bring a photo ID and proof of their address. So they could kill two birds with one stone by using their North Carolina driver's license. So if the driver's license is up to date and it has the photo and it has a voter's current address, it's going to work for both of those purposes. If for whatever reason the voter has, for example, moved and they have not gotten a new driver's license yet, they're going to need a secondary document that demonstrates this is where I live. So that's something that's called, right, in lawyer speak, it's called a HAVA document. That's a federal, that's the Help America Votes Act. It's the law that helps describe and set out. Here's how we verify from an administrative perspective that people are who they say they are, that they are in fact qualified to vote, and here's how you do that. So really that just means you're going to use the same kind of official ID or official proof of address that you would use for other kinds of government activities. So you're going to use, right, your utility bill. You can use a bank statement, right? You can use some form of formal paper or electronic documentation that has your name on it and has your address on it. And so those two things together means that you're good and you're going to be able to be registered to vote during early voting. And so the reason we always start this particular session talking about voter registration is because the number one reason that ballots get thrown out after an election is because of a problem with a voter's registration file. So we're going to talk about something called provisional ballots. These are ballots that voters get to use if there's some problem when they show up at the polls. It's the catch-all ballot that says, hey, we can't find you in the system. There's some kind of problem. Something's wrong. Use this provisional ballot to at least get the paper down and we'll see if we can sort it out. The biggest bucket of provisional ballots every single year are ballots that are cast provisionally because there was a problem with the voter registration file. And usually the problem with the voter registration file is that it can't be found because it doesn't look like the voter registered. So this is something that we always want to revisit with folks, both as, for ourselves, make sure that we're still registered, but also with all of our friends and family and folks that we interact with to just check, are you registered? Registering doesn't mean that you have to vote, but it is required if you want to vote. So encourage everybody to go and register so that they have the option of exercising their right to vote when they so choose. And so within the category of voter registration, something you might have heard a lot about in the last several months, if you've been following along with the North Carolina Democrats, is the registration repair project. So if you remember last fall, we had this issue where Justice Allison Riggs beat her opponent for the state Supreme Court by 734 votes. The person who lost to her, he was not happy about that. So he initiated this whole big lawsuit using these legal theories that had been put forward by the Republicans in separate earlier lawsuits last summer that had been rejected so far. And he was claiming that, look, there are a ton of voters on the voter rolls that shouldn't be allowed to vote. There's missing information. And the information he claimed they were missing were either a driver's license number or the last four digits of their social security number. And so that wasn't allowed to go forward, right? That theory was rejected by federal court. The new Republican state board of elections decided that they were going to resurrect this theory on their own and run with it. So the state board of elections identified 103,000 voters in North Carolina whose voter files appeared to not have one of those two numbers. So all of those voters were put on a list, the voter registration repair list, and were told, if you do not update your voter registration files before you next vote, you will be required to cast a provisional ballot. So there is a website that the state board runs. It has a public search that anybody can use to find out if they are on this list or if anybody they know is on this list. And there are three different ways that a voter can go about repairing their voter file. But if they don't do that, unfortunately, what this means is that voters who are on the list potentially might be marked as inactive. The board changed its opinion about that, but we're seeing a lag in the data. This tag is still being used for some voters, so we're just kind of tracking it and paying attention to it. But the big thing is that when these voters on this list next show up to vote, they will be required to cast a provisional ballot. This is true even if they show up during early voting. So while other issues with your registration can be updated, resolved during early voting, this one issue cannot. So those voters will essentially be given, here's a special envelope and here's a ballot. Please go stand at this table over here to fill out your ballot. Put it in this envelope. The envelope will be marked as provisional. It will be marked as a registration repair ballot. It will be put into a locked box, and then it will get reviewed by the County Board of Elections before the ballot actually gets counted, and included in the final tally results for that election. So all of those ballots ought to be counted. Being on this list is not a reason for a voter to not show up and vote this fall, or for the primary next year, or for the general next year. But it is something that voters should know to expect, right? That this is the process that they will face if they show up to vote and they are on this list. Um, if the voter does not actually have a driver's license number and they don't have a social security number that they can use instead, there is an alternative path for them to get registered and have their file updated. They should just call their county board of elections to learn more about what that process will look like. And so for the voters who are on this list, don't want to have to wait, right, till to go cast a provisional ballot, they can go in person to their county board of elections office to update their voter file. They can also update their voter registration online through the DMV. So if they just go to the payments.nc.gov, it's a terrible website name because they're not actually paying anything. This doesn't cost money to update your voter file. This is just what the portal is called. But if they go there, they can go through the process of updating their registration and resolving this issue before they next vote. The other option, there is a form that the Board of Election mailed to folks in at the end of August. They're going to do it again in December. And so they can keep an eye out for that form. The NCDP will have a phone bank that picks back up in December for this, and we're going to do some in-person canvassing then also to help people with this. But those are the three methods. And then we always have the catch-all option of folks are allowed to, right, go and vote provisionally this fall. They don't need to wait for any of these methods. They can just go show up and then watch on the back end to make sure that the administrative process does what it's supposed to do. Christy, any big questions so far? Yes.
Yes, yes. So I freestyled and answered a couple. So let me just have you verify that I said the right thing.
Yeah.
Going back to returning citizens, people who had a felony conviction, all aspects of that conviction need to be resolved, including paying any restitution in order to be able to register to vote again, correct?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, the payment issue comes in and out, but that's the current guidance. If it changes, we'll send an update.
Very lawyerly response, by the way. That is
It
my
depends.
understanding. I appreciate that. Okay, we had a question. GE said in Robeson County, 400 plus registered Democrats who voted last year have been placed in inactive status. How does that happen? Because they're not on the registration repair list.
Yeah, so that happened. We've been told that that is a system glitch, which is why we're keeping an eye on all of it. Just yeah, send up prayers and good wishes for the IT folks at the State Board of Elections who are being asked to do a whole lot. We don't have a very good reason for why that relabeling has occurred. It doesn't stop people from voting. So people should still go and vote even if they have been shown as inactive. And we are working with folks at the State Board to figure out why that happened and if there's anything more going on there.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions that are really just about, hey, this sounds dumb. Are the Republicans really that stupid? Which is basically having
Welcome to 2025, y'all.
that even if you registered before 2023, you've got to have that number on your registration now.
So yes. And to emphasize, like no federal court has told them they need to do this. This is not an interpretation of HABA of the relevant statute that's been taken anywhere else. And placing this burden on voters is truly a novel thing. And again, it's something that the National Republican Party tried to force through last summer and lost. It's something that Jefferson Griffin, in his lawsuit to overturn Allison Riggs' election, tried to argue in federal court and lost. And now they are using their power as the majority on the State Board of Elections to do it anyway.
Okay, so the answer is shenanigans. Thank you.
Answer shenanigans. Yes.
And clarifying that you don't need a real ID to vote.
Correct. You do not need a real ID to vote. It's not the TSA.
Um, yeah, Joan Reed says they can't just put your number on the form at the time of voting.
You'd
No.
think. You really would think, but
Yeah.
no.
Okay, here's some fresh ones. Here we go. What happens to the provisional ballots? Are they counted?
Yes, they are. And we will talk more about provisional ballots at the end of our journey through the life of voting.
Okay. Let's see here. Oh, so my daughter moved from Harrisburg to Concord, but she works Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5. How can she make sure she can vote?
Yeah, so she can look up her voter file on either iwillvote.com or on the state board's voter lookup to see what her current status is. Um, and if she's not registered, she can do it online. You can do it at any time when you do it online. Especially if there's not a weekend early voting option this fall for her.
And your employer needs to give you time to go vote.
No. If you have a union job, maybe, but that is not.
Oh, I've lived in other states where they have to let you off. That's not North Carolina. Bummer. Okay, more tomfoolery. Um, so, so back to that question, the clarification is that her daughter has not yet updated her driver's license to her
Yeah.
current address.
Mhm. Yep. So when she registers to vote or updates her registration, she'll just need a different she'll need a different document. So a bank statement, and it can be an electronic bank statement, a utility bill, a rental agreement, just some other official document that shows what her current address is, and that'll work instead.
Okay, for registration repair,
Mhm.
if you're on the registration repair list and you have to vote provisional this fall, will that be enough to take you off the registration repair list for next year?
Yes. So everything should get fixed with the registration repair if you vote this fall. And that's what we're monitoring on the back end. So that envelope that you put your provisional ballot in, it has a space on it for either your driver's license number or the last four digits of your social security number. So including those numbers on the provisional ballot is the administrative fix to update the file online. So with that, let's keep talk. I'll talk more about provisional ballots once we get there. But for now, let's go ahead and keep moving to talk about photo ID requirements. So there's not a lot new from last year for photo ID, but it's still newer to folks. So want to make sure that we talk about it. So North Carolina is one of 36 states that does require a photo ID to vote. This is now going to be our third year having this requirement. So it first went into effect in 2023 for the municipals then, and it was in effect all of last year. So the good news is we did not see nearly as many problems with implementing photo ID as we were expecting. So there was always a concern that something like this was going to discourage people from voting or that people would show up, not know what to do, and be turned away. The data didn't bear that out. Obviously, we'll never know the people who self opted out because they heard about this requirement and didn't think they could satisfy it. But for people who did show up and either, had out of date IDs or like had problems with it, they were still able to go through the process and have their votes counted in significant ways, which is good. But we trust nothing, so we keep on relearning this information to make sure we're still doing it again. So the good news is that the law for photo ID North Carolina includes a lot of different types of ID. So your North Carolina driver's license will work. Another state's driver's license will work, right? If you have registered to vote in North Carolina within 90 days of the election. Anybody can go and get a free photo ID from their county board of election. They can also get a free ID card from the DMV. There are almost 100 school and public employee IDs that also work. So those are universities and colleges and community colleges, and then like municipalities and other types of government IDs. Um, and then you can also use your US passport or passport card. So the ones that I just read through, those top ones, they do need to be either they need to be current, so they can't be expired, or they needed to have only expired in the last year, with one exception from that we'll talk about in the next slide. However, these two other types of that are italicized at the bottom, a military or a veteran's ID and a tribal enrollment card. Those IDs are allowed to be expired, and they can be expired for any amount of time. So if you have your military ID and it is from 30 years ago, that is still okay. That will still be accepted as a legitimate form of photo ID for somebody who shows up to vote. Now, the exception to the expiration requirement are voters who are 65 or older. So if there is a voter who is 65 or older and they use an expired ID, that ID is still going to be okay if it was current on their 65th birthday. So if somebody last had, right, a current driver's license, like when they were 65, but now they're 72 and it has since expired, they are allowed to use that ID still. So that is something to where if you know voters who are 65 or older, there's a special carve out for them. It might require some math, but it is available to them to use. And the other thing to know about photo ID is that what poll workers are taught to look for, what they're being trained on, is they're being taught to look for whether or not the photo ID reasonably resembles the person voting. So if you are not same day registering for the first time, the poll worker is not checking the ID's address. It's not checking, right, any of that kind of information. It's only looking at the picture on the ID and the face of the person standing in front of them. And the guidance that's been given has been very, very clear so far, right? That reasonably resembles standard means that, look, so long as a normal person behaving in kind of a reasonable way would say, yeah, this looks like you mostly, that's going to be good enough. So changes to a person's appearance based on them aging, based on changes in their gender presentation, based on wearing glasses or not wearing glasses, wearing religious garments, none of those different kinds of changes are reasons to reject that person's photo ID, so long as you can still kind of say, yeah, this mostly looks like you. This reasonably resembles you. That's going to be good enough. So obviously, there's a lot of room for potential abuse in that standard. That's asking a lot of our poll workers. And so here's the thing to know if a voter does not have a photo ID, or if the person says, like, I don't think this reasonably resembles you, like we need something more. So first of all, voters who show up to vote and don't have an approved ID on them, they are allowed to vote with a provisional ballot. And then they can come to the county board of elections later with their ID or with another form of ID and satisfy that standard. Now, big change here from the past. It used to be that there were about 10 days that a voter could use to go to their county board of elections to show an ID to have their ballot counted. That has gone away. After a bill that was passed in December of last year, voters now only have 2.5 days. So they have until the Friday at noon after the election to go to their county board, show their ID, and correct, right, that problem with their ID. So that is a very fast turnaround, especially for voters who vote on election day. But that is still an option. However, the better option, the better alternative, is for them to submit a provisional ballot and an ID exception form. So the ID exception form is part of the statute that created our photo ID. And any voter is allowed to request and fill out an ID exception form based on them having a reasonable impediment to showing a photo ID. For example, if this is a voter who doesn't have transportation, right, and can't go get a new ID, if they have lost their ID or if their ID has been stolen, if they have a disability or an illness that again prevents them from going and getting a current ID, all of those are reasons that are impediments to having a current photo ID that is approved. So that's the kind of the biggest carve out for this requirement. If that person also has religious objections to being photographed, that is an acknowledged exception. And then voters who've experienced a natural disaster within 100 days of election day. So last year, this was Hurricane Helene. So we had a lot of folks all over the state, especially in the western parts of our state, who were displaced and they didn't have their ID on them, or it had been destroyed. And so they were all able to still go and vote with the ID exception form. Um, so the only thing that a voter cannot say in order to get the ID exception form is, I think the requirement that I have an ID is stupid and I don't want to. That's not allowed. That is not a real reason to not have a photo ID. There is no conscientious objector status for this requirement. You do need to actually say, like, I don't have an ID and I can't reasonably get one, or fall into these other two exceptions. And so we really want to make sure that voters understand that if they have a reasonable impediment to having a current approved ID, they are allowed to vote with the ID exception form. Poll workers are supposed to be trained to affirmatively offer that form to voters. In last year, we saw not everybody did that. And so this is something that we keep tabs on that with volunteers that are at polling places. And it's something we want to make sure that we tell voters that, like, even if you're not offered this form, you're allowed to ask for this form and use it. All right. Any quick questions, Christy, about photo ID?
I think I've kind of kept up with them. There are a couple that I know you're going to get to in later slides, like how ballots are counted and stuff. But Chris did share that a neighbor who's immunocompromised was forced to fully remove their mask last year when to vote in the
Mm.
polling location. That seems to me like
Yeah, so
oh,
that would be not okay. The poll worker should not have demanded that of them. That voter is also entitled to vote curbside this like going forward. And so they're allowed to be in their car and vote and maybe remove their mask if that is something that the poll worker asks them with the windows still separating them. But yeah, that's a lot.
otherwise, I think the questions have been answered, or I know they're coming up on
Or
future
they're coming up.
slides.
All right, I love it. All right, well, let's keep on going. All right, so now that we've talked about, right, how do you register to vote, the requirement for voting of using a photo ID, let's talk about the methods of voting in North Carolina. So we have three methods of voting here. So first, you can vote by mail. Um, for this, there are specific deadlines. So for the November election, that deadline is you have to ask for the absentee mail-in ballot by 5 p.m. on October 21st. And that ballot must be returned by 7:30 p.m. on November 4th, on election day. It used to be the case that there was a grace period that the mail-in ballot only needed to be postmarked by election day, but that it would still be counted if it arrived at the County Board of Elections office up to 3 days later. That's no longer true. The deadline for the return is 7:30 p.m. on election day, so the same time that the polls close. In addition to voting by mail, we also have early voting. So again, 16th through November 1st, again, unique to each county. So double check whether or not that is an option for you this cycle. Unless we get a new law, it will be available to everybody next year for the primary and for the general, but for municipals, it's not required everywhere. And then we have, of course, day of voting on November 4th on election day. So within those options, these are the different processes for voting by mail. So for voting by mail, this is a simple form that can be completed online. Returning an absentee ballot can be done through a couple different ways. One, you drop it in the mail again, and you just mail it back to your county board of elections. It can also be dropped off. The absentee ballot, excuse me, request form can also be dropped off at the county board of elections if you don't want to do it online, or if you don't want to mail it. And then fortunately, in North Carolina, we actually have a nice way of tracking absentee ballots. And by we, I mean voters can track their ballots. Nobody else can track your ballots. But after you mail in the request form and you then go through the life cycle of your mail-in ballot, there's a system called ballot tracks where there's a unique identifying number associated with that ballot that helps you make sure, right, that it's still going through the process. So, some things to know about absentee ballots in particular. So, in North Carolina, it is a felony to falsely submit an absentee ballot request form. So, you can't just decide that you're going to like do your friends and family a favor and submit requests on their behalf. Voters need to ask for it themselves, or they need to specifically have a reason that they can't do it themselves and they need to ask you for help. You can't just go around willy-nilly doing this. There are lots of reasons for this. One of the big ones is because North Carolina is one of the only places where we had an actual ballot fraud effort that was done in 2000 in the 2018 elections by Republicans in Congressional District 9, where they were collecting people's mail-in ballots, fraudulently filling them out and returning them. So now we have all these new rules that limit how this can be done. So don't fill out other people's absentee ballot request forms. So the voter themselves has to fill out the absentee ballot, and they have to do it in front of two witnesses. This is something that a lot of times people don't understand, or they need to do it in front of a notary public. Fun fact, if you go to UPS, USPS, or FedEx, they are not required, they are not allowed to charge you for being a notary for a ballot. So you can go to any of those places, have them notarize, watch you fill out the ballot, notarize it, and that's good. Or you can just have two witnesses there as the voter fills out their ballot. The voter then has to include a scanned copy of a valid photo ID or include that same ID exception form. So there's a yellow photo exception form that goes out with the absentee ballot. There is a special privacy pocket in the envelope for the ballot, and that's where either the scanned copy of the ID or the ID exception form goes in. And so the ballot and those documents go into the return envelope, and then the envelope gets mailed to the County Board of Elections. So the envelopes can be returned either right in the mail to the County Board of Elections. They can be dropped off in person at the County Board of Elections, or they can be dropped off at any early voting site in the county. All of those three methods are options for a voter trying to return their mail-in ballot. So there are a lot of folks, especially when it gets towards the end of the early voting period, who choose to go and drop it off at an early voting site just because they don't know how long the mail is going to take. That's completely fine. The one thing to know is you cannot return a mail-in ballot to an election day voting site. It's only during early voting. On election day, if you want to return your mail-in ballot, you have to then go to the County Board of Elections office in order to do so. Some of the frequently asked questions about mail-in voting in North Carolina, right? People want to know, do I need a special reason to vote by mail? No. North Carolina is what is called a no excuse mail-in ballot state. So you don't have to certify that you have a disability or an illness or that you'll be out of the country during the time and thus justify your request. Lots of people will do this because they don't know what their schedule is going to be like the 2 weeks leading up to an election and on election day. And so they just want to have this kind of as a safety net for their voting. People also frequently want to know if they are allowed to fax or email their request for a ballot or the ballot itself. The answer is absolutely not. The form has to be signed and printed and mailed and all of that. Or if you want to do it online for the request, you can go through the DMV. But returning a ballot has to be that physical ballot, and it has to come with that ID or copy or ID exception form as well. And then what people often want to know, like, what if I make a mistake on my ballot, right? What if I filled out the wrong bubble for a particular candidate? So there are two ways to handle that. One, you can call the County Board of Elections and say, I got my mail-in ballot, but I messed it up. I'd like to spoil this one. Can you send me another one? So if you have enough time, you can handle it that way. The other way of handling it is you can just go to vote in person instead. Obviously, that's not possible for everybody. A lot of folks ask for a mail-in ballot because there are limitations on them going to vote in person during early voting or on election day. But you are allowed to request a ballot and then not end up using it. So long as that ballot has not been returned yet to the County Board of Elections, a voter can instead go vote in person. So if that ballot has been received already, right? If they have proof, if they have in their system that nope, this person's ballot got sent in, mailed, and we've got it in our office waiting to be counted, that voter is not going to be allowed to vote in person. Obviously, that would be double voting. That is a crime, and we don't do that. Um, and then the last question that folks tend to have is, am I allowed to return my neighbor's finished mail-in ballot? So the general rule is no. The general rule is that the only people who can return a mail-in ballot are the voter, the voter's legal guardian, or a close family member, right? So you can't just do it for like friends and neighbors. If you are part of the immediate family, you can, or if you're the legal guardian of a voter, you can. The exception to this is for a voter who has a disability of some kind. Voters who have a disability are entitled to ask anybody they want, with some minor exceptions, to help return their ballot for them. So those are all the different options for absentee ballots. It has been declining in use in North Carolina for a while now, partially because of early voting. So, early voting is the number one method that most people in North Carolina use to vote, especially during the even years when it's widely available all over the state. So, for this fall, where it's available starting on October 16th, and it will end on November 1st. So, we've got those kind of two-ish weekends that early voting is allowed. The schedules will vary by county. So the statutes will set out this is the day it opens and this is the day it closes. And everything in between is up to the counties themselves. So the counties get to decide where they're going to have voting sites, how many voting sites they're going to have, and what their hours are going to be. So all those decisions got made over the course of this summer by the new members of our county boards of election. But you can always look it up through the State Board of Elections website, with the early voting site search. So this is going to be the most flexible option for the most people, when it's available. So this is where have same day registration. So this is where folks can show up and, if they've changed their names or if they've moved, they can update their registration. If they've never registered before, they can do so here. Again, the only thing they can't do during the early voting registration is repair their ballot, their voter file under the registration repair, again, for reasons that make no sense and are not rational. This is also when mail-in ballots can be returned during early voting to any early voting site in the county. Voters are allowed to vote at any voting site in their county. So unlike on election day, when you have to vote in your particular precinct, during early voting, you can pick anywhere in your county that is most convenient to you, right? So you can go to the place that's like closest to your work over your lunch break. You can pick a place on your commute to your kid's soccer game. You can go anywhere in the county during early voting. And then curbside voting is available at all early voting sites, and is frequently more convenient than curbside voting at election day precinct locations. Because there are fewer voting sites for early voting, because they're open for so long and for so many days, there a lot of times their site selection, one of the biggest factors is, do we have a good workable parking lot for us to have curbside voting at? And so the curbside voting tends to be easier and more accessible during early voting, even though it is also available on election day itself. And then, of course, the last chance that we all get is voting on election day. So that's going to be November 4th this year. So voting starts at 6:30 a.m. and it ends at 7:30 p.m. And that's going to be at every single precinct location across the state. And so voters have to go to their specific precinct location. State board has still not yet posted November 4th precinct locations, but there should be the same as all the prior years precinct locations. We're just waiting on confirmation of that. So voters are going to need to bring their IDs when they go and vote. And then no matter what happens at that polling site on election day, if something goes wrong and you're being told we can't find your file, there's something wrong with your form, whatever, all voters are allowed to say, like, I want a provisional ballot. Like, I want to be able to at least cast my vote in this way to see what's going to happen. And so provisional ballots are the catch-all ballots for voters who experience some form of a problem when they show up to vote. So provisional ballots get used when there is a question about the voter's qualification to vote. It gets used if the voter's eligibility to vote in a specific election is under question, if they've moved recently and can't quite tell, right, which precinct they're supposed to be in, for example. It's used when the voter's eligibility to vote a specific type of ballot is in question, or when there's just some other problem, right? So this is when, like, yeah, you're on the registration repair list, or you didn't have your ID, and so you had to use this ID exception form. Provisional ballots are just look, there's some kind of problem that we can't figure out here. We're going to have the voter fill out a ballot. We're going to put a marker on it for saying what the problem is. And then we're going to use the period after election day to see if we can solve that problem and then get to the point where that ballot can be counted. And so that process, right, in terms of how those ballots are going to be counted, is what happens in the post-election day, typically, process. But with all of those different approaches, right, those three different methods that we have for voting, the thing that voters should always understand is there are multiple safe and convenient ways to vote. And voters really should feel empowered to pick the option that works best for them and to make sure that they utilize it. Um, so I'm going to save questions for that because I feel like there are probably more questions about provisional ballots. So let's talk about provisional ballots and what happens to ballots after election day, or after they get cast. So counting ballots does not happen at a statewide level. It happens inside of all 100 county board of elections across our state. So our county boards of elections had some big changes this year. So in December of last year, the General Assembly passed a last minute law that changed who appointed the tie-breaking votes on all of our county boards of elections. So all the county boards have 5 members, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then one person who used to be appointed by whoever won the governor's office. Republicans had gotten a little sick of continuing to lose the governor's office. And so they decided to change it. They decided instead that it was going to be the auditor's office that would be responsible for appointing the chair of the county boards. And so now we have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats on all of our county boards, in addition to our state board. And so these boards start convening before early voting to start counting, to not start counting, to start reviewing absentee ballots. So this is where they don't count them, but they check to make sure, are the witness signatures there? Was a copy of the ID or an ID exception form included? They essentially check, were the rules followed in how the ballot was submitted? And then they say, yes, put it in this stack to get counted, or they say, no, put it in this other stack for follow-up and for chasing and curing to see if we can get that voter to fix the problem before the deadline for counting. Um, all the way that, so that all that process happens through early voting. And then election night, after 7:30 p.m. when the polls close, that's when tabulators, the big machines that have all of those ballots and the records of the ballots that were cast, that's when when they start running and all of the counting starts happening. And that is also when the boards start meeting to review provisional ballots and to review any problems. And so there are a lot of automatic processes that all of these county boards have to go through before they can finalize an election. So North Carolina is a paper ballot state. So even where we have machines that are counting ballots, all of them still produce a physical paper trail. So it is not possible to have just like a virus or a bug infect our machines and to ruin everything and us not be able to figure it out. That because we have paper ballots and we have paper trails for all of our elections. So after every single election, we have random audits. So the state board, like there's literally a like bingo rolling thing and like dice that get cast in order to pick 2 sites per county that go through a full audit. So those can be an early voting site and an election day site. They can be 2 different election day sites. They can be the mail-in ballots plus an early voting site. All of the different methods are up for grabs. And this randomized system selects, we're going to have 2 sites. So those 2 sites get a hand count of a bipartisan team that literally go through manually confirming that that vote count is accurate. If there's a problem with that manual recount, like manual audit, that's when other processes get triggered. But this happens automatically in every single county. The boards will also go through the provisional ballot process. So they're the full-time, right, nonpartisan staff at the county boards first go through the provisional ballots. They sort them into their different categories, right? These are the provisional ballots that have the ID exception form. These are the provisional ballots where there was a problem with the voter registration file. These are the provisional ballots that were on the registration repair list. And they go through and they figure out what they can administratively resolve. So for example, all of those registration repair ballots, What the staff are going to do is they're going to take those ballots. They're going to see that on that ballot envelope, the voter put their driver's license number or the last four digits of their social. They're going to add those numbers to the voter's voter file. It's going to get updated. They're going to confirm that like that's a real human being when it's cross-referenced with like the DMV. And then they're going to say all of these ballots are legitimate. All this voter has done everything they need to do. They will tell the county board of elections our reviews found that this stack of ballots is completely fine. And then under law, the county board is required to approve those ballots and have them added into the total vote count. So this is the process that goes through. It is mostly a full-time staff process that then gets reviewed and confirmed by the county boards of elections. So the county boards of elections hold public meetings for municipal elections for 7 days until they get to the final result. So this is why election night results are not the final numbers that we all know and like burn into our brains later on. It's because the votes change a little bit based on counting these provisional ballots, making sure that all the mail-in ballots get counted and all of that process. So those 7 days after election day for these staff members is truly an incredibly intensive time. Um, there are also optional county processes that can happen depending on things that are going on. So, registered voters are allowed to challenge another voter. They have to actually show up in person and say, I believe this human being is not eligible to vote, and here's why I think that. You are not allowed to just wander around saying, I don't believe this person looks American enough and I don't think they're allowed to vote. Or, I think this person has a criminal record and they shouldn't be allowed. There needs to be a factual basis for it. And the person who's making this claim has to show up in person and they have to bring some receipts. They have to have evidence. But that is a process that can go on. Candidates or voters can also bring an election protest. So this is where they say something went wrong at a particular voting site. There were irregularities in how the poll workers were acting. There was some sort of problem here in how the election was managed. So they can also raise that particular issue. And then, of course, candidates can always ask for a recount, or a board can trigger a recount if it's within a certain margin. So it's not something that everybody can do for any reason, but it's something that's always on the table, depending on what those kind of final tallies ended up being. Um, so all of these processes are things that we have volunteers who attend these meetings, they watch these meetings, they check to make sure that things are on the up and up. But these are kind of the very nerdy, the frequently very dry processes that go on before an election is actually certified. And at the end of all of that, that's the life cycle of a ballot, y'all. Assuming litigation doesn't happen. And we're just going to put that in its whole other bucket because there is no time to talk about all the possible craziness that can happen with lawsuits. But in anything approaching a normal order, that is the process. So there are lots of ways you can take action here. First of all, lots of resources for you. So obviously, the North Carolina Democratic Party, we have a lot of resources that are on our website, but the State Board of Elections truly does have a lot of resources that you can look. It has the polling place locator. It has the site where you can look up your voter registration and see what your status is. It'll also show you sample ballots. It has a lot of different grab and go resources. So always feel free to check that out. If you really want to nerd out on the law, there is an election law index that literally has from kind of A to Z all the different laws that are relevant to voting in North Carolina that you can poke around, and it gets updated very frequently. The North Carolina Democratic Party also has a hotline. So this is something that has live hours during the work week, kind of during the middle of the day, but we have volunteers who respond to any voicemails that are left on the hotline within 24 hours. So anybody can call, leave a message, and we will get back to them to make sure that they have what they need. And Christy, do you want to share more about the trainings that are on offer? And I will stick around to continue answering questions. I just want to get to the end so that people who want to leave can leave.
Yeah, so I will include all of this in the follow-up email as well, and all the links that I've been dropping in the chat. But the additional training opportunities, voter protection, election related, are for people who are interested in being outside poll observers or inside poll observers. The inside poll observer is a more strict and regimented program than outside poll observers. So depending on which path people are taking, Kat and I will be back for more of those trainings. Then there is also poll greeting. This is not so much voter protection related. This is more party affairs, organizing, where you stand outside and greet people who are coming to vote, try to recruit them as volunteers and let them know about our Democratic candidates. That is coming up. Of course, we are also canvassing. So we have a couple different canvas programs going on, including a whole bunch of canvases in support of municipal candidates this year. And then I think I do Canvas trainings on Thursday evenings. So if you know somebody who is maybe on the fence about canvassing, send them my way on a Thursday night. We'll pump them up. And then the content package. If you haven't signed up for the content package, I will include that link as well. A lot of great resources for posting on your county party's social media accounts. Um, then we have office hours. Mine are Fridays at 11, and I do have them every Friday from now until the election. So feel free to pop in and join me for that. Yes, Vanessa, this session has been recorded and I will post it to YouTube and include that in the follow-up email as well. So with that, I'm actually going to stop the recording.